Hello and welcome, friends, to the best, most in-depth, most awesome leg press video you've ever seen. We're going to answer pretty much every common question as it relates to leg presses. You can check out all the timestamps here for your reference and convenience. We'll cover everything that you need to know, including but not limited to why leg presses don't actually train all the quads and why people are confused about hamstrings in a leg press and much, much more. So without further ado, let us jump right in. All right, we need to start with a dissection of the anatomy, both in terms of the muscles involved and the joints that those muscles act on. We all probably are familiar with the concept that the leg press is a hip and knee exercise predominantly. So we're going to go over the three major muscles that we're training in any leg press. And we'll talk about setup and execution in later sections in terms of how to bias each of these muscles. But for starters, I wanted to begin with one of the more odd muscles, one of the muscles that people either don't even know the name of or don't even know is involved in leg presses. And this, by the way, is I think why many people are confused about the whole hamstrings in a leg press thing, which, as I said, we'll cover later. But this right here, if you don't know, is your adductor magnus muscle. And yes, it is a behemoth of a muscle. And the portion of the adductor magnus, which is trained with any kind of leg press, is this portion right here. So you all see how there's all these different portions here with all these little nicks on the back side of the femur bone, right? The portion of the adductor magnus that's really going to contribute mostly to leg pressing is this portion right here. So they call this the hamstrings portion or hamstrings division of the adductor magnus, which is because of the fact that if you look at it from the side, this bone right here, the bottom of this bone right here, this is called the ischium bone. The bottom of this bone is where the hamstrings actually attach to. So if I could like draw hamstrings on here, hamstrings kind of run down from here into the bottom of the leg on the shin. And so when a lot of people are feeling fatigue in their, quote, hamstrings, what they're actually feeling is this big ass muscle on the inner thigh known as the adductor magnus. And so this is a powerful hip extension muscle. And hip extension is basically an action where you are performing the leg press, the concentric portion of the leg press. So we'll go over the joint actions more in depth in just a little bit and how the different biases are actually created, obviously. But this is the first muscle to consider whenever we're talking about any form of a leg press. So the second major muscle, or really muscle group, is the glute maximus. Now, there are two different and major portions of the glute maximus. And when we look at the two different portions, here's one right here. It's kind of this upper slip, and then here's kind of this lower slip. And these different portions, if you can actually look at the insertion sites right here and right here, actually do have distinct attachment sites. So if I zoom all the way in, really up close and personal, and I rotate all around, sorry for this weird visual. Okay, what you'll see from this angle is that there's this slip right here, and then there's this slip right here. And this slip right here is the lower glute max that attaches directly into the femur, while the upper glute max kind of wraps around the side of the femur. And so when we're talking about leg pressing and we're talking about, really pushing anything away from us, whether it be a leg press sled or just the floor, right, in any kind of normal squat, the portion of the glute max that really is going to be contributing to that most is this portion right here, this lower portion, because it's going to be much better at pulling the leg downward, i.e. that hip extension thing I was referring to earlier, as compared to this portion up here, which has a kind of blend of motions, which isn't going to be the topic of this video, but I think it's worth noting that whenever we do something for leg pressing related goals, we're really primarily going to be focusing more on this portion of the glute max as compared to this portion, though there are ways to bias more the upper glute max, but you have to do it single leg if you're going to do it that way. And then, of course, last but not least, we have all of our quad muscles. If you saw my first video on leg extensions, you saw me go over all the anatomy on this stuff, but just for some quick review, you have the vastus medialis, you have the vastus lateralis, you have the rectus femoris, and then underneath of the rectus femoris, you have what is known as the vastus intermedius. There is one additional quad. It's called the tensor vastus intermedius, which is positioned kind of up here that they discovered within the last decade or so, which also will, be something that is trained. I'm assuming these apps will be updated at some point to reflect that. But when we're talking about a leg press, we'll go over this later when we talk about the whole hamstrings conundrum, there is this muscle right here called the rectus femoris, which if I layer it back on top, is the only quad that crosses the hip joint. So you all see how up here there's this long tendon, it kind of splits out into two things. It looks like a Y shape up here. Because of the fact that the rectus femoris crosses the front side of the hip, it's really, really going to be limited in its ability to contribute to any leg pressing motion, any squatting type of motion, because it will directly oppose the forces we're trying to create. Again, I'll talk about that more later, but worth noting that when we're training leg press for the quads predominantly, a quad bias leg press, this quad is going to be less involved than the others. Though I do think that depending on the population, that's not super relevant. For instance, if you're a beginner trainee and you're only doing leg presses, right, you probably cross the necessary threshold for hypertrophy and strength. If any of you are trainers who are working with clients, you don't need to drive yourself crazy thinking you're not training this quad with a leg press at all, but just worth noting that it is not by any means the prime mover of any leg press. All right, now in terms of the joint structures that are involved in a leg pressing motion, as I mentioned, we have two main loaded joints. You have 3+ moving joints, but the main ones we're concerned with are the knee and the hip. And we'll talk about the others in the context of setup and execution a little bit later. So when we look at the knee and we think about the knee is a hinge joint or something that kind of is close to a hinge joint. So for those of you who don't know, a hinge joint is just a joint like the elbow or like the ankle that just pivots in one direction, right? It's kind of like a wrench around a bolt type of thing. The knee can rotate a little bit, but primarily it's a joint that's just concerned in moving in one direction. And so whether or not we are moving our knee like this or we move our hip out to the side like this, which occurs over here, well, it's still bending and straightening in the same direction. In the same way that if I do a curl like this, and I'm doing a biceps curl here versus I have my arm out here, the elbow motion is not what is changing my arms in space here. That's me moving my shoulder and my elbow is doing the same exact thing. So regardless of, you know, how wide we put our stance, narrow, right, our knees be our knees regardless. Unlike the knees, however, the hips, which is this joint right here, the femoral acetabular joint is the technical term for this joint. Our hip joints, like our shoulder joints, are ball and socket joints. Our hips are basically just versions of our shoulder that move less in total. And so we don't have as much total range, but the principles are the same, meaning we can rotate our hip this way, we can rotate it this way, we can move it up, we can move it down, and then we can also rotate it inward and outward. By the way, this is internal and external rotation. People get this confused because they're looking at this bone, but if you just kind of look at the direction of this guy, external rotation is when this sort of top of the bone is moving outward externally, and the opposite for internal. Okay, so why does that matter and why is it important? Well, because it's the basis and the foundation for understanding the mechanics of how we can sort of cater the particular leg press for the particular goal. So for example, a leg press, which is more straightforward to backward narrow, is going to be different in terms of muscle recruitment from a leg press that is, let's say, similarly foot placed, but maybe the toes and the legs are slightly farther outward, right? Because the path then changes. And so given that we can really change the hip position, we have differences in what we can recruit based on where we place our feet, right? Because beyond some of the cueing stuff that we can do in terms of where we think about moving, what really will ultimately matter more is where you put the feet and what that leads to upstream. So just to get some terminology down here, because I did mention some jargon earlier that I wanted to clear up. Whenever we are talking about the hip motion and things like hip extension, okay? Hip extension is motion, if you just focus on this femur bone right here, sorry, this thing is in the way a little bit. If you just focus on this bone right here, hip extension, if you're in a leg press, is the action that is this way, okay? So hip extension is basically when you kick your leg backward behind your body like that. Knee extension would just be this. And so regardless of whether we are moving this way or this way in a leg press, we are always loading hip extension and knee extension. What does that mean? Well, I just said, for example, that this is knee extension, right? So how could it be, Ben, that in a leg press, when we're moving in this direction, how could it be that we're loading knee extension? Because the opposite motion is happening at this joint, it's bending in the opposite direction. Well, the reason that's the case, we're still loading knee extension, is because of the forces that are going to come from the foot plate that are trying to act on our body. So there's a distinction here, which is very clear, or that I want to make very clear, rather, right out of the get-go here, which is that motion is not the same as loading, right? Because regardless of where we are in the leg press, we're always loading hip extension, which is why we already talked about the glute max and the adductor magnus as our hip extensors in this case. And we're always loading knee extension, which is why we always, or really only talked about the quad muscles because they're knee extenders and not the hamstrings, which again, I keep mentioning, but we'll talk about those later on. So overall, these are the things that we need to know about the joints. The joint position changes are going to be a consequence of where we put our foot and how that sort of ends up changing our mechanics upstream. But ultimately, it's just about hip and knee motion with some secondary stuff going on at the ankle and potentially the spine to allow for us to get into and out of those positions. So next, let's move on to actual setup and execution, starting with the glute max. All right, so starting with the glute max. For each muscle, what we're going to do is we're going to go over the setup concepts and the execution concepts at once. And we're going to go glute first, adductor second, and then quad third. And then we're going to bring it all together with some other concepts as well. And so when we're thinking about, okay, the glute max, how to stretch it, how to shorten it, the glute max is going to stretch and contract in what we call a plane of motion that is like a little bit more narrow to the body, and that is obviously in the context of a leg press fully bending our hip, right? Because the glute max, again, is the hip extensor, and so in order to fully stretch it, we need to be in what is known as hip flexion, which you can think about in a leg press as like shoving your femur kind of toward your face. Now for starters, I want to just outline the kind of spectrum of feet positions here, right? Because what we can do with our feet, we have these different toggles. We can move our feet upward and downward. We can move our feet wider or more narrow. And in addition to these two things, we can also move our toes our toe angle inward and outward. So we kind of have these three different toggles that we're going to play around with for each setup and execution here. And keep in mind that really what I'm going over here are broader generalizations and sort of principles and patterns. I don't want you to get too caught up on hard rules anywhere along our discussion here. So again, for glute max, this is kind of the position that we're aiming to capture in the bottom. Why? Well, first of all, if you look at the position of my upper leg here in the bottom and its relationship to my torso, this angle right here, known as the hip flexion angle, is going to be the angle that actually stretches fully the glute max, right? Because the glute max, again, is wrapping around the back side of this joint right here. And so although it looks like, oh, Ben, look at how not bent your knees are, I'm like, yeah, exactly, brother. Why aren't the knees fully bent? Well, because I don't care about my, biasing my quads if my goal is to bias my glutes to target my glutes. So for every muscle that you're seeking to bias, you want to put other muscles in a sort of less advantaged position just by definition. And in this case, what that means is keeping the foot and the foot angle roughly close to 90-ish degrees in the bottom position. This is not a hard rule, as I mentioned. You can be slightly, above or below 90 degrees depending on what leg press you have and depending on your limb lengths and how they're different. But in the bottom position, it's helpful to make sure that you have a couple things in check. One is that if you film yourself on video, you want to kind of see your feet and the foot plate, again, close to that 90-degree angle with your shin. Doesn't have to be exact, number one. And number two, you want to see this bone right here pretty much approximating your torso. And so a good rule of thumb for the glute max is number one, that foot position, and number two, you want to kind of imagine that your knees are being pushed toward your chest by the resistance of the leg press, which is to say that if you could draw a line straight through the feet like this, do you all see how that line is basically pushing the sort of upper half of the leg toward the chest? You'll see how much this contrasts from the quad dominant leg press, but this is a really fundamental principle of hip dominant leg pressing, which is basically you want your knee to kind of get smushed toward your chest. Now, many people, I think, will make the mistake of just basically allowing their knees to kind of smush into their entire body and allowing their femurs just to kind of get pushed backward almost behind them. We're going to go over in a little bit why that's not such a good idea in terms of what's actually happening, but just thought I'd mention that first off, is it's not like more knee back equals better. Remember, our goals are to maximize for range of motion at this joint, which doesn't always mean getting as far back as possible. Now, the other thing we need to consider with the glute max in particular is foot position width. I highly recommend starting off with a more narrow foot position. This is something that in general I think many people are confused about, which is this concept of hip width. Many people's hips are much more narrow than you might think. And the reason that I say that is because a lot of people assume that hip width is somewhere out here, right? People like slap the sides of their, their side glutes and the outside of their leg, and they say, oh, this is where my hips are, right? Especially though, if you're a hypertrophied, strong person, there's gonna be some tissue here, not to mention just fat tissue as well. So a lot of people have a poor estimation of where their hips are actually sitting because they're touching stuff all the way out here, right? But your hips are actually more narrow than you think. So hip width, if you look at this whole femur, is not standing with your legs somewhere at this angle, it's actually standing with your legs quite narrow. And in order to, again, fully stretch these glutes around the back of the pelvis, you want to be moving forward and backward in that more narrow foot position. So for me, that's gonna look something like this. I personally love having my feet narrow, just it's more comfortable for me for a whole host of reasons in a vast majority of lower body pressing cases. But a good rule of thumb is just kind of track up from that sort of hip angle to begin with. And you'll see kind of like what is more comfortable and what isn't, obviously. But a good starting point is just, maybe feet slightly inside of your, what you perceive to be your hip position. This for me, feet straightforward is a good starting point. Remember that when we target glute max and when we stretch glute max, we want to do so in that forward to backward direction. And so you don't want to put yourself in this position with this narrow stance and then, angle your toes all the way out wide so that your knees go kind of behind your head. Again, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but in the context of fully stretching your glutes fully stretch when your leg is kind of in front of your body, not when it's all the way out to the side, right? Because that's going to be more specific to the next muscle we're going to talk about in a second here. In terms of the final phase of the setup, a couple things we want to make sure of. Number one is that we're always going to be making sure that we're pulling up on these handles. When you start to add a lot of load to the leg press, this should happen more sort of reflexively, because if you don't do that, what you're going to notice is you're going to start to slide up just perpetually in the seat. And so make sure that you are anchoring yourself down with your hands, meaning that you're almost kind of performing like a row-ish type of motion, especially in the bottom position where you're going to try to push as hard as possible in this way, right? Because pretty much, a leg press is like as stable a motion as it possibly gets. The only thing that you need to really pay attention to is number one, what we just talked about with the hands. And then number two, kind of creating your own internal anchoring and stability in your brace. Now, do you need to drive yourself crazy with, doing a Valsalva that's going to make you feel like you're going to explode? No. But principally, and this is more important for the hip-related motions than the knee-related motions, you want to make sure that your spine isn't moving all over the place. A lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, they just shove their legs as far backward behind them as possible or toward their face as possible. And in reality, a lot of times what's happening is the foot plate is continuing to move downward, but the motion is not being controlled by any of the hips. And specifically the glute max in this case, a lot of times the motion is actually being controlled by people's erectors. Now, just to give you all a simple sort of visual of what I mean by this, there's going to be a certain point at which you stop being able to move backward, okay? And you're going to stop being able to move backward because you're going to run out of hip flexion range of motion, which is to say that you're going to run out of the thing that is actually stretching your glutes, whether it be because your femur and your ilium bone, this big hip bone, actually hit each other, which is unlikely because bones don't ultimately actually touch, but there's a lot of stuff in between these two bones right here. There's going to be a certain point at which your glutes are fully stretched, and then to continue to drive the appearance of motion this way, what will happen is your butt is just going to do this tucking thing, okay? So what's going to happen here is the pelvis is going to kind of roll backward, and when the pelvis rolls backward, kind of like that whole butt wink thing, I mean, it's exactly like the butt wink thing. If you're lowering down further into a squat and your pelvis is tucking underneath of you, your glutes aren't stretching anymore. What's happening is your spine is actually just getting rounded into the pad so that you can appear to be moving a little bit more. So perhaps a more clear visual here for you all. The femur is going to move. At a certain point, this stuff is going to run out of room because there's going to be tissue here. And then instead of continuing to move, again, about this joint, about the hip joint, what's going to happen is the whole pelvis is going to go like this, right? And when the whole pelvis goes like this, you'll see how my femur still moves in space. And so the leg press sled can continue to go down. But again, I've maxed out my hip bending, and then I'm just tucking past that point. So it's a really good idea that you actually gain an understanding of what it's like for these two bones to fully reach their max capacity to actually bend toward one another. Because if you're just consistently doing this tucking thing, you're gonna think that you're getting more stretch in the glutes or the adductor muscle, when in reality what you're doing is you're just starting to stretch your lower spine muscles, your erectors. Now for quad related pressing, the whole tucking thing might actually be advantageous. So we'll talk about in the quad section why that might actually be the case. All right, so the two things there, again, just pull up on the handles, make sure that you're locked in and stable, you're not shifting all over the place, huge part of the setup. And then number two, make sure that you're sort of bracing so that you can actually get a sense of, okay, when does my femur kind of just run into my belly? That's a good way to think about it, is I like to think about, okay, when does the top of my quad really start to run into my lower abs here? And then just reverse out of that position, because you're gonna notice that if you go beyond there, you're gonna lose a lot of tension relative to if you just kind of actually stop the motion with your glutes there. Now then, in terms of execution for this motion, we really have two main toggles for every kind of leg press, right? Because overall, we don't have too many execution options. There's not too much to screw up, thankfully. And so the two things I want to bring your attention to, number one, are foot position and foot pressure, really foot pressure more so. And then number two, what you pay attention to as far as the shin versus the upper leg, the femur up here or the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula down here. So when it comes to foot pressure in a glute dominant leg press, we really want to focus on more so the heels. Why do we want to do that? Well, when we drive through the heels, what we do is we predominantly make more of the pressure in our foot, obviously through the heels. And typically speaking, when people focus more on one part of their foot, they actually adjust their range of motion upstream to account for that. And what that will do is it will create a force direction that is hopefully something that looks like this. And you know, we haven't gotten very much into the torque stuff and the moment arm stuff, but for those of you who aren't familiar, really what determines what actually works the most, like the underlying reason for all the things I'm talking about here, are related to this very simple concept of here's a force direction. That force direction has some distance from the knee joint and it has some distance from the hip joint. You'll see how tiny this little knee line is and how big this hip line is, right? That is basically a representation of what is being loaded more, longer line, longer distance equaling more torque, i.e. more resistance. And so the underlying rationale for this whole shin position, and then as I'm saying now, for this whole heel dominant pressure thing, is so that we can create more of a distance between the hip joint and the load direction as compared to the knee joint and the load direction. That's really what determines muscle recruitment ultimately. You can of course learn about all that stuff with my courses and my membership too if you're interested in that. But for now, just remember the fact that when we're doing more of a heel pressure type of thing, that's going to be more of a hip dominant influence because of that short knee line and that long hip line. Now, in addition to that, I highly encourage you, if the heel thing works out great and you're like connecting with your glutes instantly, great, stick with that. Bottom up is a great approach. But if the heel thing for some reason isn't working out and you know you feel like your shin angle kind of looks similar to mine in terms of the whole 90-degree thing and you're maximizing for this and you're doing everything right, sometimes it can just be a sort of cueing related issue where you're not necessarily focused on moving the right bone, so to speak. And so what I would focus on if I were you all with a glute dominant leg press is actually driving with the knee. Okay, this is a concept we see mirrored in, let's say, back training. So many of you probably know that, like, when you're doing a pull down or like a row, you want to think, at least initially, less about pulling with your hand. You want to think more about pulling with your elbow. And when people say the elbow, they don't really mean the elbow joint, they mean the end of the bone that is controlled by the chest, for example. So this whole bone is the femur. The end of this bone right here, right? When you think about pushing it that way, this is the whole bone that is controlled by the glutes. So if you're focused on the end of that bone and where it's going, it's going to be a really good sort of cue and direction for your brain to follow. Because when you focus on your foot too much, like, what is the muscle that really ultimately is going to control your foot more directly? Well, as we'll see later, it's going to be the quads, right? Because the quads are attaching directly to this bone right here. So when we think about the glutes, we want to think about the end of this bone, like the knee. And when we think about the quads, we actually might want to think more about, you know, the feet as a relative proportion. But as I mentioned earlier, again, that heel pressure thing is totally fine if you want to think more about that. It's just one consideration, or really two considerations rather, so that you can sort of decide what works better for you. And so just to kind of finally let this thing play, because I know so far we just looked at sort of still frames of this whole thing. This is what it would look like. It was obviously just, I didn't add weight because it was just a demo video for my exercise library. But this is basically what it's going to look like without any load and with a ton of load. Again, the major keys for the glute dominant leg press: feet narrow, feet close together, feet higher, so we kind of are finding that whole 90-ish degree angle thing through a vast majority of the range of motion. Heel pressure focus plus knee direction focus. Those are the main things to sort of concentrate on. Okay, so if we want to shift the focus from the lower glute max, again, remember that anatomy section. When you're doing a glute dominant thing in the context of a leg press, it can be more biased toward the lower glute max as compared to the upper, although the upper is still involved a little bit. If we want to shift things from glute territory to adductor, inner thigh, adductor magnus territory, there's really only going to be one change that we need to make. We've kind of covered all the setup and execution principles so far that are just going to apply pretty much identically to the adductor group, right? Because when we're thinking about the adductors are just yet another hip muscle. So in terms of the foot position up to down, we don't really need to change anything, right? We're still thinking about that 90-degree angle here. So if you see in the bottom position, here's the foot plate, here's my shin around 90 degrees from that foot plate. We're still thinking about pulling up on the handles. We're still remembering to keep a firm brace in our core so that our spine isn't flopping and flailing all over the place. And the only real difference is going to be the sort of stance width and the toe angle and what that leads to. So if I let this play, you'll see another angle here in just a second. The only real huge change is going to be this. So for me, when I do a more adductor dominant leg press, the change that I'm going to make is I'm going to go wider, and intentionally kind of wider than hip width, so that the path of motion can not just be forward to backward for, you know, more of a glute dominant thing, but more inward to outward. And this can be confusing to visualize, so let me just show you all something. The narrow stance glute thing that we just looked at, if I just sort of demonstrate with the pelvis and the femur, looked kind of like this, right? But when we move our foot position out to the side like this, the path of motion becomes more inward to outward, right? So rather than a straightforward to backward thing, to bias more the adductors, right? The big muscle on the inner thigh, that hamstring division of that adductor magnus, we just move our leg outward. Why do we move our leg outward? Well, we move our leg outward so that we can move more inward to outward. So you'll see how when we move in this diagonal into out plane, we're not just moving forward to backward, right? Because the glute max, it's really a forward to backward orienting muscle like this around the pelvis, but the adductor is on the inside. So to stretch and contract that more, we need to be moving inward to outward, inward to outward. Think about, you know, the most stretched position in a seated adduction machine, it's when the leg is here. So we want to get kind of comfortably close to that, and then just do a normal leg press in the femur direction. We'll follow that, and the recruitment will more shift toward that inner thigh muscle as compared to the glute max. Now, something that's really important to make mention of here is the fact that this is not a binary thing. We do not all of a sudden put our feet wider and magically I snap my fingers and abracadabra, my glutes turn off and my adductors switch on. No, it's always an intricate balance of both of these things. When you're putting your foot more narrow, and you have more of a glute recruitment thing. That's going to bias the glutes, right? We use the word bias because the proportionality of the load is managed more greatly by the lower glutes in this case. And when we move our feet out, that bias shifts a little bit. But there's no point at which we have, 5% glutes, 95% adductor, or vice versa, right? Because both of these tissues are hip extension muscles, and they're both managing different sides of the same joint. And so they always need to be kind of talking to one another to manage the torque from the leg press. So when you do this shift, just keep in mind that you will still have both of these things. It's just the proportionate bias will shift. And when we talk more about programming considerations, that may be something to consider in the context of your other exercises for this day in terms of whether or not you do, which kind of leg press or what leg press you lean toward. So again, aside from that, all the other cues and concepts are going to be the same. Remember that 90-degree thing. Remember that concept of thinking about driving through the knee rather than through the foot. If you are going to concentrate on the foot, great. Think about it more as a heel dominant press than a toe dominant press. Again, lock in with the hands and keep the core braced. More range is not necessarily better. However, when your stance is a little bit wider, you will be able to probably get a little bit deeper. So do keep that in mind. That is another feature of what makes it more adductor dominant. The reason for that is when you are moving in a more straightforward to backward position, these bones run into each other. The stuff in between runs into each other sooner. And when you move the leg outward, you all see how you kind of have like more space and freedom to move this way, right? So that's just a situation where you will get more joint range of motion into hip bending, but that range of motion is actually less specific to the glutes. So don't get this confused. A lot of people get this confused. They assume that if they move the foot plate further back, that's going to be just more better for everything, okay? Range of motion should not be determined by whatever the hell the implement is doing. This is why I'm so focused on joints and joint position, is because when we look at an angle like this, that's what we need to focus on. We need to focus on motion at the hip joint and really what the hip joint is doing. I don't give a shit about the leg press as far as how much or how little the leg press is moving. And keep in mind that this is not universal, so your hip structure may differ from mine. You may find that you get plenty of range of motion in either case, and they look very similar. For me, I definitely get my knees kind of farther backward with this wider stance, and many people do. So just keep that in mind as a general concept. Narrow for glutes, wider for that more inner thigh. The bias will shift, but ultimately the kinds of cues that you're going to use in terms of the heel and knee focus are going to be the same. All right, so the real reason that everyone is here, quads. We want to talk about quads. Cool. When it comes to the setup and we think about our major variables, feet up to down, feet wide to narrow, well, what we want to first consider is the fact that we want a shin angle that is much closer to looking like it's parallel to the foot plate in the bottom position. So there were a lot of qualifiers there. Here's what it would look like. Rather than having the feet somewhere up here, so imagine my shin were up here, right? That is what would look like that 90-degree angle thing from the foot, and where we're really focused on, smushing the knee, imagine the force direction up here, smushing the knee toward the chest. That was the hip dominant pattern that we assumed. But when you move the feet down the foot plate, what changes? Well, the contact point in the force direction relative to your joints. So here's what that looks like. Rather than the feet being all the way up here, the feet move down, and as a consequence of that, the force direction will look something like this. So rather than knee being smushed to the chest, for quads, the heuristic is something more like, I want my feet to be smushed toward my ass. And when the feet are smushed toward the ass, and this is the force direction, look at these lines, baby. So short line here, long line right here. Now we have a humongous distance of this line to the knee and a tiny, tiny distance from that line to the hip. Again, that's the whole torque thing, the distance thing. But to explain it in non-sort of like technical physics terms, it's basically just foot smushing toward butt. Why? Well, because number one, we get the knee fully bent, and so the quads are fully stretched in this position. And number two, with that accounted for, the hips and the hip muscles really don't have any leverage to move the leg out of the bottom position with this particular setup, right? Because think about what it would be like for the glutes to pull on the back side of the leg like this. Again, they would want to kind of move from the knee forward, so they would try to move the knee this way, which would literally antagonize my shin from moving in the direction that it actually needs to. Another way you can think about this is just imagine that I'm in like a leg extension, right? A leg extension force direction would be like a pad kind of going like that. This is just like a few steps removed from that, where instead of a pad being here and pulling that way, it's more like the pad is kind of at the bottom of the foot and pushing at a little bit of an angle this way. And so if I let this play now, what you all see is that mimicked. So yes, there's more range of motion, the leg press gets lower, my knees bend more, but the reason that all that is occurring is for a very specific reason, which is I want to bend my knees under a circumstance or in a circumstance where my quads are loaded. Insofar as legs inward or outward, this could vary, but I highly recommend that you start with a narrower foot position and a lower foot position and start to experiment from here. Now at this point, many of you may be concerned, Ben, I see that your heels are coming up. Oh no, Ben, isn't that bad? Isn't that bad for my legs? Isn't that bad for my ankles, my feet? The answer in short is no. What I would recommend to you is if you're new to this kind of style of leg press, and we'll talk about what a middle ground between all these things might look like, as well as other leg pressing variations and what they might look like. But overall, the thing that you need to primarily be concerned with here is, am I adapted and ready for this stimulus? No position, no motion, no exercise is inherently going to be good, bad, or any other sort of vague qualifier word. You need to take into consideration what your preparation for the activity is. So for example, I can do this technique with a lot of relative load, get my quads at muscular failure and be perfectly comfortable doing that. But a person who's never done this strategy maybe should take it a little bit more easy, maybe should not use as much load as they actually could, maybe should take it in the progression slower so that they can actually adapt to this kind of thing. I've heard people have bad experiences with it, and you don't need to do this, but the directionality here is very important. So if you don't take your feet off the foot platform and smush your legs all the way to your butt with your heels up like I do, that's totally fine. I'm just showing this variation to paint what the extremes would look like, right? The one extreme with the foot all the way closer to the top, the other extreme with the foot closer all the way to the bottom. Now the good news for you is that even if you have your feet lower like this and you can't get your knee fully bent, there is a way to be able to do that. And it's kind of what we talked about earlier, except now we look at it as a positive thing, which is that allowing that pelvis thing to happen. Remember that tucking thing that happened that we talk about in the glute section, where our pelvis kind of rolls underneath of us? Well, allowing the pelvis to roll underneath of ourselves, like that posterior tilt, that dog, taking a shit type of thing, that butt wing thing, allowing that to happen is actually, I think, a good strategy for people who want to keep their foot on the platform in the context of a quad biased leg press, but who, if they don't allow the pelvis to shift, cannot achieve that range of motion. So unlike the hip dominant leg presses, unlike the glute version, unlike the adductor version, allowing the pelvis to roll is actually a great strategy to get more range of motion out of the knee and loading on the knee if you want to keep your foot on the platform. Just keep in mind that the rolling is fine in this context, in most cases, because of the fact that the loading direction is actually close to the spine. So here's what that would look like. If my feet are all the way up here, right, and here's my shin, like we were talking about with the hip dominant press, and as a consequence of this, the load direction is, let's say, just pointing like an arrow like this. Think about how far this arrow is from the segments of the spine. It's really, really far. And so when you do the hip dominant thing with your feet high and your pelvis is rolling, not only, again, is the range of motion being controlled by a non-target muscle, but you also have a lot of load on the pelvic tucking, and so very quickly it can become uncomfortable for people if they're not used to it. But if your feet are lower, let's say not totally off, but somewhere here, and you have this knee bend, allowing that roll to happen is actually mostly fine, because if the force direction is lower like this and it's kind of coming down at an angle, see how close it is to the spine? It's almost like going right through the spine. So to that whole torque moment arm thing, you need to understand that as a separate concept if you really understand these things. But basically the short is when you move your feet down, the spine forces get lower. When you move your feet up, the spine forces get higher. And so if you're gonna do the pelvic rolling thing, Do it in the quad dominant scenario, not only because it allows you to get more range of motion out of the knee and the quad, but it keeps the loading specific to the knee, which is again the most important thing, is the loading is specific to the knee, not just the motion. And in addition to that, the loading on the spine is minimized because the load direction is kind of close to going through it. So unlike in our hip dominant scenario where we didn't really want to see that rolling thing, when people are using a leg press where they can't get, relatively like a mostly knee bent position, I actually recommend that you start to play around with and get used to rolling your pelvis back a little bit and just allowing that to happen under control. Again, much like the whole feet up thing, this is just a situation where it's not good or bad, but your preparation will determine what it kind of ends up being for you. So if you're new to that concept, you're new to these ranges of motion, take it slow. Don't go to failure on your first time doing it. Don't even go to failure on your first couple times doing it. Get the motion down. Load progressively, load slowly, load at a rate that you maybe think is almost too slow to begin with, because you'd rather be, I think it's better to just be more careful than not with new types of motions and exercises. So this is just a situation where, again, what works in one situation that makes no sense in another and vice versa. So now in terms of execution and cueing for quad related pressing, whether your foot is kind of peeling off of the platform or whether it stays on, again, both are perfectly viable options, given all the context that you now understand. We want to think about the foot pressure, number one, and sort of where we're cueing the motion from, number two, in a kind of opposite way that we did for the glutes and the adductors, right? Because for the glutes and the adductors, we really wanted to focus foot pressure kind of closer toward the heel. But for the quads, we want to focus more on pressure toward the forefoot. And the reason that we want to do this is because when we think more about the forefoot, what happens is we tend to think more about kind of almost a subtle kicking the platform upward. And when we do that, again, keep in mind that the whole goal of the quad dominant leg press is to imagine moving this segment and kind of kicking it forward, almost like it's a little bit of a leg extension, right? So when we're thinking about foot pressure, we want to lean in the direction of the forefoot, again, in any case, and that pairs nicely with, rather than thinking about the knee like we did for the hips, we want to think about the end of the bone that the quads directly control. So here are the quads, they're pulling somewhere here, ultimately through the quad tendon down into the patellar tendon, which connects to the tibia, right? These quads are pulling here, and so we want to focus on the bottom of this bone almost kicking forward. So again, sort of inverse to the hip dominant related cues, we want to focus more on forefoot pressure and sort of motion toward the end of the shin. Again, the way that I would summarize it is kind of just like more so a kick on the platform than a drive on the platform. And that applies again, whether the foot is fully on the platform or not. We're still thinking about more forefoot dominance and platform kicking as compared to that heel dominant thing that we were talking about with the hips. All right, so before we move on to looking at different leg presses and then getting into other questions around hamstrings and stuff like that, I wanted to just go over what a kind of hybrid, so to speak, leg press would look like, which is really just a fancy way to say, what would a kind of middle ground between the extremes we've talked about so far look like? Well, in terms of the bottom position, which again is I think the easiest place to kind of start when we're starting to do a force analysis, right? Because that's where the maximum difficulty and loading actually is. You want to basically strike again in the middle. You don't want a shin position that's kind of like really folded up down here like we had for the quad dominant thing. And you also don't want a shin position that's really high up here with that 90-degree thing, right? Because remember those arrows, one of the arrows was kind of like smushing knee to chest. That's our hip dominant pattern. One of the arrows was kind of smushing foot toward butt. That was our quad dominant position. And then this, if this is the sort of foot plate, foot platform, we strike the middle ground right down the middle here. Ideally, you want to see some force direction that has some distance to the knee and some distance to the hip. So if I kind of just let this play here, you'll kind of see that show. You'll kind of see that like, okay, reasonable to strike a middle ground if your goals are exactly to do that. And I wouldn't overthink the setup on this particular exercise, as long as you're kind of somewhere in the middle. Your body and your brain, as long as you don't have too specific of an intent, like you're just pushing and pushing and pushing, your body is going to use as much quad and as much glute and as much adductor as it can in order to perform the motion. And so the way that I advise people to find this sort of hybrid position, yes, we could look at it from a force perspective first, but a lot of times this position is just gonna be whatever the strongest position is, assuming that you're using like a decent amount of range of motion, right? Like if you're using an amount of range of motion that is like half of what we see here, well then, yeah, that's not what I mean by strong. What I mean by strong is you feel the comfiest with your feet wherever you have them, and you're feeling kind of like a vague blend of like just all your leg stuff being recruited and fatigued after the set. Now, some of you may think, Ben, you could have your knee bent more, Ben, you could have your hip bent more. For me, this is like the most comfortable position. And so, you know, if we're not like doing an extreme quad or an extreme glute dominant thing, again, my advice to you is just find the position for you that feels best. And for me, especially with this leg press setup, when I start to sort of allow things to get a little bit deeper than this, things start to get a little bit messy for me. It's not that I can't do that. It's just when I do that, I tend to feel less overall productivity in the motion, less sort of area under the curve of every rep. So if you're trying to kind of strike the middle, so to speak, on all these goals, find the comfortable position. For me, again, this is kind of what you see here. And you know, all of this keeping in mind, of course, that ultimately all leg presses that you can do are a form of hybrid, you know, quad plus hip, as we went over earlier. So don't, you know, get into the mode of thinking that some people do when they start to learn this stuff, where they go too far in one direction, assuming that it could only be one thing. In reality, it's always both. It's just that there's this bias and this shift throughout the different ranges, or rather throughout the different exercise variations that we can, you know, select. All right, so now I want to cover some of the mechanics of different kinds of leg presses. The leg press we looked at so far is a Cybex leg press, which I believe is around a 45-degree angle. This right here is the one that I use most at my gym. This is the Arsenal leg press. I would say it is among my favorite leg presses in terms of accomplishing, you know, overall as many goals as one could with a leg press. And I want to kind of go over the differences between a leg press like this and some others that you might see that may do some weird arcing stuff in different directions. So I'll just kind of let this play. This was a set that I just did actually earlier today. And this was a setup that I used predominantly for a kind of quad biased setup, but of course there were some good amount of glutes involved as well, and some adductor sprinkled in there. So just to kind of very briefly go over some mechanics here. If you can't see it, my foot is slightly up in the bottom, right? So a lot of the pressure is in my forefoot, and a lot of my intent is to kind of like shove almost like a little bit upward into the platform like we talked about, right? So here's that knee distance, here's that hip distance. So you see there's still a good amount of hip contribution here, but again, mostly a knee dominant exercise for me. And so this is the way that I kind of did it when I was doing it for quads. And in addition, something I haven't talked about just yet, because I wanted to wait for some contrasting examples to show you all this. Notice that the angle of the seat, and this isn't, you know, going to be the case for every leg press that you're going to have this sort of wiggle room, but when I do a quad dominant version, I tend to like the seat as reclined as possible, just because of the fact that, you know, you kind of want a lot of room for your foot to kind of travel close to your butt, whereas it's a little bit less important in the context of a hip dominant thing, because with the hip dominant thing, the direction of force tends to make it so that it's pushing you farther up in the seat. So when the seat is at a higher angle like this, which I'll show in a second, you start with a little bit more back support. And so the stronger that you get on a particular variation, the more that you're going to want like some firm brace behind you, because you're only going to be able to hold yourself down so much. But when I'm doing this quad dominant variation, I'm relatively much weaker because I'm not trying to use a ton of my hip muscles. And so given the reduction in load, I can kind of stay stable here. So let's see what happens when I move the seat up though. All right, so it looks, again, subtle, like a subtle difference, but really I went from somewhere maybe here to, I don't know, 20 or so degrees higher than that. And what that allows for is a little bit more of a firm kind of back support. Again, it allows me to not sort of slide upward. And given that this is now, you know, a foot higher position for me. But when I tend to do this variation, I tend to just use more load. And so pushing this way more into the foot platform again, with a resistance that will be close to the knee and super, super far from the hip somewhere. When I do this kind of variation, I like to put the backrest up a little bit more so that for every little bit of effort that I exert this way, I have some, more support that's kind of closer to being, 90 degrees from that force direction. All in all though, many of you might not have access to like a really good leg press that has a super high degree of adjustability, that has a foot plate that's kind of angled like the one that you're seeing here so that the ankle can kind of start in a more open position. As long as you kind of understand the principles of what you're actually trying to do, there are so many different ways that you can make it work. For instance, a lot of leg presses, they start with the sled really, really high, so it almost kind of feels like you're folded into a pretzel to begin with. Well, guess what? That might just be a variation that just is more of a hip dominant thing for you, and trying to turn it into something that's quad dominant might just not be the best selection, but even in that case, you could actually make some adjustments. So let me show you some examples of that. All right, so here is, I believe, a hammer strength press. And a lot of times this ends up being like, okay, the starting position is such that the foot plate is not tipped at all, right? So it's like my ankle is already kind of starting in what would be maybe like a neutral ankle position. So I don't have that sort of tipped angle that allows me to get super deep with ankle range. And my hips are already starting at this really high angle. So immediately, and when most people use this intuitively, this is kind of what they do. And this is a fine exercise, by the way. But what are we looking at here? Again, just recycle the principles. Here's the force direction. Here's how we would draw it to the knee. Here's how we would draw it to the hip. You can draw that out and look at those moment arms and think to yourself, okay, this is a more hip dominant setup. But again, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to our foot pressure. Okay, so just kind of repeat that. But what you could also do is, and I just was playing around with this here today, you could put your feet lower like this. And this is where something like the sort of sissy style, almost like leg extending leg press comes in handy, which is that when you move your legs down and you really know what to look for and you're comfortable with this kind of technique, if you didn't have another option that you liked for training the quads in this position, well, guess what? Like, that's a fine thing to do. Now, before we go over to the two other kinds of leg presses I want to talk about today, I do want to point out just I think a really important thing to understand, in particular about the hip dominant press. So a lot of people, as I mentioned, will kind of know, okay, I want my feet to be a little bit higher. I want my shin to be closer to 90 when I do the hip dominant press. But a lot of times what happens is, especially just in general with exercise and also in life, is people tend to assume that, okay, if some of this thing is appropriate for my goal, then more of it must be better. So what do people do? A lot of times people put their legs up here, right? And they put their legs basically as high as humanly possible so that in the bottom position, this is kind of what it ends up looking like. So in the bottom position, this may be perfectly fine, but a lot of times, again, just to draw that stuff out, here might be the force direction, really close to the knee, far from the hip. But a lot of times what people neglect to do is think about, well, the other positions, the other sort of portions of the exercise and what the forces might be. And this is where I want to introduce this concept of the hidden force, which is, I guess all forces are technically hidden because we can't literally see them. But the force that a lot of people don't think about is the force of friction and what friction does to the force direction of an exercise. So when we think about friction, friction is basically just the force that kind of keeps your foot in place here. So the direction of friction, and this is a heuristic that you can use across many scenarios, is always going to be opposite to where your feet would slide if they could. Okay, so just use your intuition. If you imagine this whole leg press is just a sheet of ice, in this position, where would Ben's feet slide? Ben's feet would slide this way. Hopefully we can all sort of just kind of intuit that. And the reason they would slide upward is because of the angle of my shin and the direction of my quads are kind of pulling my feet. So the direction of friction actually goes this way. It holds the feet down so that they don't slip up in the direction that they want to. But what does that do? What influence does that have? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. If you want to learn more about this, join my community, because I go in depth on all the biomechanics stuff that you're hearing about now in the members group. But basically, the way you want to think about friction is that because of the fact that it's pushing to some degree down, and because of the fact that this sled is pushing to some degree this way, the actual force vector that we are resisting basically becomes a combination of those things. It's called the resultant force. And so the friction pushes this way, and the force from the plate, which is called the normal force, pushes this way. And so the actual force direction is basically like a vector sum of those, which angles in this direction. Okay, so the summary of that is basically because of friction, the force direction is kind of angled more like this. So why is that important? Why does it matter? Well, when you get to, let's say this phase of the leg press where you're kind of pushing immediately out of the bottom, you might think, oh, foot higher equals more glutes, but if that force direction is angled like this, well, guess what? That force is going right through your hip, and it's really far from your knee. So when people go extremely, extremely high, they fail to recognize the fact that the forces are actually changing from what they think that they are. They're sort of moving overly, like too much in the direction of the glute stuff, to the point where it then just becomes now a quad dominant motion. Okay, so if you're thinking that higher is better, think again. Some degree of feet higher will be more glute until it's not. All right, so I just wanted to hop on these other two leg presses to show you all kind of the different kinds of leg presses. I'm sure there are plenty of others, but I wanted to kind of cover the main kind of archetypes. This is a big archetype of leg press. It's basically a leg press that kind of has an arc to it, but the arc is kind of going from high to low like this. And so when we think about like, okay, well, what would this leg press be good for? I'll just let this play. I didn't do a ton of reps here, but I did enough for you to see. So watch the foot plate, watch my feet going back, and then it kind of drops down there at that last minute. So I want you all to think about, in terms of the principles that you've learned so far, well, what might sort of be recruited in these different positions, and what influence might that leg press foot plate actually have? Well, if I get to this bottom portion of the range, like super, super deep, I'll scroll back here to the one that the rep I did earlier to kind of demo this. This might be a situation where if I really capture that downward portion of the motion of that plate, well, what happens to the force in the force direction? Well, basically, think again principally, where is my foot being shoved when the foot plate is going this way? Well, it's being shoved directly to my ass. So if foot is kind of being influenced toward ass, that means that the force is sort of being more of a knee bendy force, as we went over. It's trying to basically pull the foot downward to some degree. And so as a consequence of that, you get a lot of knee bend and a lot of quad in this bottom position. But the second that you come out of that position, and or if you kind of stop the motion here, well, guess what? Now we're just looking at a force direction that's kind of like moving slightly down and is tipping slightly. But mainly it's still, the way that we would look at it is just in the same way that we looked at all these other things. So whenever you're looking across these different leg presses, just remember that regardless of the direction of the arcing and what is happening to the resistance profile, etc., that ultimately you can boil things back down to these fundamental concepts around where is the foot plate influencing the foot, how is it influencing the foot, and what is the resulting joint torque that's created as a consequence of that, and how does my body need to respond? It sounds complicated at first. It's really not once you get it down a couple of times. One more thing that I did want to sort of harken back to here also is notice how in order to get into this bottom position, from top to sort of this portion, it's all pretty much knee and hip. So you see my knee and hip, everything from here to here is pretty much glued. But for me to get lower into the motion, given my mobility, given the constraints, watch what happens to my butt. Boom, so you kind of see that roll of my butt. Watch watch anything here for the reference. In order to get kind of past this point, and you can just, maybe the most clear point is actually this space right here. I actually, in order to get more knee bend, I will consciously allow my butt to come upward like that, right? But when I'm doing the glute dominant rep, right, I'm keeping everything, boom, pinned, my ass is not moving. So this, again, reflects our earlier conversation around when that sort of pelvis rolling backward thing may be more or less appropriate, just in another context now. All right, so one more version of a leg press, which is kind of, it's tend to be called a hip press, as you can see here. This kind of press in general is set up, as the name indicates, to be a hip press. And the question is why? Well, this kind of leg press kind of arcs sort of low to high, right? So unlike the one that we just looked at, which was kind of like it went from high down lower, this one's almost like scooping up underneath of us. Why is that relevant? Well, when we get to this bottom position, this plate, again, given its kind of scoop in this direction, it is much more sort of naturally aligned, I'll say, with the arc of motion of this bone. Why? Well, let's just go to our fundamental principles, go to our force direction. What's the force direction from the foot plate here? All right, look at the distance to the knee, look at the distance to the hip. And so when I allow this to play, again, this was just a kind of demo weight, right? You see how there's that kind of scooping effect up in the bottom. But a lot of people tend to get also a good amount of quad recruitment in this too. Why might that be? Well, again, think about the friction thing. What is allowing my feet to actually stay here to begin with, right? There's some kind of force of friction that's holding my feet downward. And so when I am interpreting this to be, oh, here's a sort of perfectly vertical force from the foot plate, it might actually be more like a combination of this and a combination of this, which may lead to something kind of more like this, right? And guess what? This arrow here, this more diagonal arrow, well, look how much farther it is from the knee compared to the hip. So this is why the intent of, am I shoving up on the platform? Am I more forefoot heavy? Am I really just driving through my heel? Am I really just sort of vertically oriented? These things matter a lot because a lot of people just push and then they're confused because they're like, oh, I see these joint angles. Look, Ben, you said do the 90 thing and now I only feel quads. Well, the reason is because you're not being conscious enough of, number one, just how you're set up to begin with, like moving the seat sort of maybe more forward may actually just help this become more hip dominant, in my case, more naturally. But I don't know, I would have to do it to see. But a lot of people, the point is, don't pay attention to where pressure is actually in their feet and what their feet are doing and how their feet are interacting with the foot plate, and they're just pushing. And so they may end up unconsciously or something shoving upward, which again creates that, you know, greater degree of force that goes downward that then makes it more knee dominant. So I know it's a lot to maybe consider at first, but when you can simplify this down to a couple key principles around the forefoot and the sort of kicking concept and what that does for quad recruitment versus driving more through the heel, driving more with a vertical intent, these are two totally different experiences that could kind of look the same from the outside in terms of the joint alignment, but in terms of your intent can change a lot. My advice to you is to try to set up the exercise so that intuitively, like my body were to just respond with the kind of pressure that I wanted, right? So for instance, if my goal were to only really target a lot of my hips with this exercise, I would want it to be the case that by the time I put enough load on here, I kind of automatically were feeling my heel the whole time. And if I were feeling more pressure in my forefoot, well, past a certain load, there's nothing I can do about it. It's just gonna kind of make the whole motion clunky. So try to set up so that you naturally feel like, okay, if my goals are hips, I'm more so, you know, feeling that intent from the foot plate in this bottom position. And if your goals are more quad dominant, well, guess what? Like you want to feel more pressure in the forefoot naturally. And so just kind of aligning all those concepts together naturally more in the setup will make it much easier for you to actually do the thing that you're trying to do rather than to kind of have to mentally masturbate your way around doing the exercise in the way that is appropriate for your goal. So while we have all these different leg presses, the ones that kind of go down, you know, up to down and down to up and just straight linear at different angles, ultimately it's all about the principles. And so a lot of people will ask me, Ben, well, what's the difference between this exercise and this exercise? And hopefully you can kind of come to see now how it's so just dependent on so many things in terms of, you know, how you set up your limb lengths, how you're, you know, cueing yourself, where you're putting more or less foot pressure, you know, what portion of the range you're even using to begin with, right? Which is kind of a different conversation to sort of have. But all these things kind of amalgamate, they combine to form the end picture, and the end result is, well, you know your experience with an exercise, and if you know that like you're only feeling your quads, well then you know you have to shift things in the direction of more heel pressure, more vertical push, more driving with the knee. And if you know, okay, I'm only getting my glutes in this exercise but no quads, you know you kind of have to shift the direction toward more forefoot, maybe a little bit more knee bend, maybe more sort of kicking with the foot, those sorts of things. And so my goal with going over all these nuances is, again, as is true with all my other videos, is not to make things overly complicated, but to explain all the information in as clear a way as I can so that you can know what to look for and think about, so that you don't actually have to think about it very much when you're actually doing the thing itself. You can just know, okay, I'm doing exactly the thing that I want to do for my goal, and I can just really push hard on all my exercises, knowing that I'm really accomplishing what I'm trying to. All right, so one of the things that I think people are confused about when it comes to leg pressing is the fact that leg presses are not a good exercise for hamstrings. People seem to, number one, think that they are a good exercise for hamstrings. The main reason people think that is because of, if you saw the anatomy section, sensation that they get on the inner side of the thigh. Again, one of the adductors, the one that actually contributes to a leg press, the one that can extend the hip, called the adductor magnus, it has a portion of itself which is called the hamstrings division. It is literally slapped on top of the other hamstrings, or really within the other sort of hamstrings. And so you don't really know that until you know the anatomy. So if you don't know the anatomy, you just assume that it's the hamstrings. Okay, so that can be the main reason. But mechanically speaking, what is it about the leg press that makes it not a hamstring motion, right? Because a lot of people think to themselves, oh, the hamstrings, they are a hip extensor, meaning that they pull the leg bone, as we went over earlier, in this direction. And so they can resist that hip flexion thing from happening. True, like in the context of a stiff-legged deadlift. But the reason this is not a hamstrings exercise is because of the fact that we need to use our quads. I mean, it's kind of intuitive once you say it, but like, okay, for every little bit of force that our quads produce this way, our hamstrings attach to the backside of our knee and bend our knee like in a leg curl. And so even though, yes, we have the function of the hamstrings, which is hip extension at the hip, every little itty bitty bit of contraction, okay, that the hamstrings create, they're gonna always create it at both joints. So when they create it at the hip, they must create it at the knee. There's no way for the hamstrings to contract without them bending the knee, or at least attempting to bend the knee. And so this is one of my cats. Say hello to everyone. Cheerio, everyone. This is Cheerio. Cheerio, everyone. And so basically what happens is anytime that the hamstrings contract, they're going to want to antagonize the motion. They're going to want to make the motion harder than it actually is, because they're essentially creating a function that resists your quads from contributing. So put simply, if your hamstrings contract, they bend the knee, and this task is a task that involves straightening the knee, right? It would be like if you were on a leg extension, right? If your hamstrings were to contract and just hold your leg there, you wouldn't be able to straighten your knee. So that's the main reason the hamstrings do not contribute to a leg press meaningfully, though they will play a kind of joint management stability role at the knee to be able to sort of manage the joint space appropriately so that the quads can do their thing, okay? Now, in addition to that, I mentioned earlier in the video that one of the quads, the rectus femoris muscle, crosses the front side of the hip and the front side of the knee. And the reason that the leg press is really only for those single joint quads, remember the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, those single joint ones that only cross the knee. The reason that the leg press is only for those is for the same reason that the leg press is not a hamstring exercise, right? Because the hamstring bends the knee, and that's going to antagonize our ability to actually straighten the knee. And from the perspective of the hip, the rectus femoris is doing the same thing that the hamstrings were doing at the knee. So if that was confusing, think about it this way. What we are trying to do with this bone, this femur bone, is we're trying to push it like that. But the rectus femoris, it wants to pull it in the opposite direction. So much in the same way that the hamstrings want to bend the knee, right, which is no good because we're trying to straighten the knee, the rectus femoris wants to pull the leg backward, but we're trying to push the leg forward. So both the hamstrings and the rectus femoris have a similar sort of problem in this case, which isn't a problem, it's just by design. They're both playing a joint management role, stability role. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there is a kind of hamstring almost on the front side of the body, because that muscle is basically like doing what the hamstrings are doing in a compound lower body pushing pattern. And it's also why doing leg extensions is super great for that rectus femoris. Why? Well, because there's no hip motion happening. So we don't need to be concerned about the rectus femoris and its sort of antagonizing of of the hip motion, in the same way that, you know, the reason we do a leg curl to train the hamstrings is because the hips are completely still and the quads are not involved. So in terms of the hamstrings and the rectus femoris, I hope that makes sense in terms of why they're just playing stability roles. I think in general, you don't need to sort of concern yourself with those things. If you're a beginner, you're probably gonna just grow plenty from doing literally anything with your lower body, but I'm guessing that many of you watching at this point, if you are still watching, hello, hi, thank you for continuing to watch. You're not in that stage, and so you want to be more specific with those sorts of things for these reasons. All right, so troubleshooting pain is a really important thing when it comes to leg press, just as it is with any other exercise. And we've already kind of gone over a lot of the variables that are going to be important when it comes to pain troubleshooting. The first and foremost thing that I would play around with if you're getting pain, and most likely I would bet that many of you are getting pain toward the bottom end of the range where it's much more loaded, I would start to play around first with foot positioning, foot width, foot, toe angle, and then also foot height in terms of, higher versus lower. And the first thing that I want to say is, if you're really, really concerned first and foremost about like the muscular biasing thing, and yet you have a good amount of knee pain or hip pain or back pain when you're doing this exercise, you're missing the forest for a single tree, which is to say that if you're really not established in any skill on the leg press and you're getting discomfort doing it, you need to start by actually learning how to load the leg press in a way that feels good for you, in a way that you can actually build strength and resilience in the tissues. This is why I said it's very important to not be sort of overly rigid and overly black and white about the, the bias thing, because when we start to think more black and white, we start to think about, oh, I only have quads if I go here, I only have glutes if I go here. What happens automatically is you start to restrict your options and your opportunities for what you can do. And when you're in pain, that is the last thing that you want to do. So a good example might be, okay, I want to make this quad bias, but every time I put my feet super low, I get knee pain. Well, guess what? Who gives a shit whether it's quad biased if you're getting knee pain? It doesn't matter to begin with, right? It's kind of like saying, I must eat this food even though this food is the only food that gives me stomach issues reliably all the time. It's like, bro, sis, eat the foods that you feel like you can digest that are maybe somewhat close to that food. Maybe you're looking to get your fiber in, but this one, kind of vegetable just makes you fart for like 24 hours. Okay, eat a vegetable that's like kind of doing the same sort of a thing so that you can actually start to get reps with that vegetable and maybe eventually then get to that other thing that you wanted to initially. All right, so if your feet are super low, you're like, oh shit, I got knee pain or I got ankle pain or something. It's okay, it's all right. Move them up and just keep in mind the intent thing that we talked about. This is something where intent is going to be really, really important, where, yeah, okay, maybe the joint angles and the joint alignment don't make it such that your quads are going to be as biased, but guess what? Maybe you can make up for that with more loading and actually pain-free motion and progressive overload longer term. So that's just one example. Maybe if you have hip pain or back pain and you're trying to bias your glutes, do the opposite, right? Make some compromise where you can get a little bit more quad involved in the motion, a little bit more help for the quads, so that you can actually decrease load on those areas that are currently sensitive. In any case, it's just basically expanding your options and your opportunities and recognizing, okay, I have all these different variables that I can play around with. Let's not be super rigid if I'm in a scenario where I am, by definition, more limited in my options, right? You do not want to limit your options. So that's a really important thing. Another thing is just range of motion, right? So it's like, if you're good for like 90% of the range and it's just like in the bottom X percent, it starts to feel like kind of garbage. Well, guess what? You could play around with toe angle, stance width, height, and all those things, of course, but you could also just simply, maybe grade yourself more slowly to that bottom portion. Maybe you could decrease the load, increase the reps, and maybe even, use pauses in the bottom of the range. Something that I like to do as a kind of universal strategy when I'm introducing an exercise is I like to go more slow than I would naturally want to. I like to do more reps than I would naturally want to. And I like to use pauses in the most loaded position. So a good example in leg press might be like, if you're doing the toes up thing for the first time, start in the 12, 15, 20 rep range, use pauses in the bottom position so you can really know what is the intent, what am I trying to capture, what the hell am I doing, and where is tension going, and then slowly work up from there, right? Because that is a point that is inherently very, very load limited, load constrained, but that provides the exact stimulus in terms of the magnitude and the specificity that you're looking for, right? So tempo, rep range, those things are all things to consider. The last thing that I would consider is exercise order. So if you're doing your leg press first in a leg session and you're getting issues with it and you're having problems with it, put it last. A lot of the time, like the compound emotions can feel really, really good when the isolation stuff is done first. So like when I do leg press, like I did today, I will do leg extensions, I will do leg curls, I will do abduction and adduction, and then I will go into the leg press. And I do that specifically because I just like being warmed up already in all my other muscle groups before I do it. You don't have to do it, it's just my preference. But you do want to make sure that you're not basically using your other exercises as kind of like an analgesic, like pain reducer, just to be able to do the leg press, right? You don't want to use your other exercises as if they're basically just Tylenol so that you can do this thing that is really actually, sensitizing your body more than you recognize, but you're just hyped up on adrenaline, you're sweating, you feel good. You don't want to be at a point where you're just kind of numbing your body out of experiencing the pain that it otherwise might. So that is a tricky balance, but you just need to kind of actually pay attention to the experience that you're having and make sure that you kind of take notes about what you're feeling, week to week and in the days after that you do the leg press. Something that can be very helpful and has been for me is either mentally or literally on paper or on your phone, like make a pain journal, right? So if you do a certain version of a leg press on, Wednesday, Thursday morning you wake up, check in with your knee. How is that knee thing or that hip thing or that back thing? What about Friday? Is it still there Friday? Does it dissipate Friday? Does it last till Saturday and then go away? Okay, well then you have a backlog of what your experience was like that you can refer back to and reflect on. Whereas if you don't do that, you have like, oh fuck, like I have no idea what I even did last week. I don't even know, like I didn't even record the sets, the load. So make sure that if you're in this pain scenario that you pay more attention to these more nuanced bits of information so that you can actually have a backlog and something to reference to and make changes based off of, because otherwise you're just throwing shit at the fan and hoping that it sticks. All right, one of my cats just took a poop, but so I might be a little bit distracted here. Hopefully I can talk as well, because it's really, it's one of those poops that's like really just violating my nostrils. But I want to address this concept of squats and how squats relate to leg presses and just the common lure around people's idea that like squats are better. You hear people like Tom Platz, who is a bodybuilding legend, who has historically some of the best quads of all time, saying things like, why do leg press? Leg press is easy, right? Do the squats instead. These kinds of opinions, hopefully, I would assume if you're watching, I don't know how many minutes into the video you are at this point, I think if you're watching at this point, you're probably not someone who is under the illusion that squats are better. Almost by definition, why would you be watching a leg press video if you thought that? But if you are someone who is a trainer, a coach, a therapist, and you are getting your client to do a leg press, and your client may, and I work with trainers every single day, I talk to trainers every single day who have these experiences with their clients, it's their classic like Google personal trainer, like, don't you think squats are more functional than leg press type of thing? And I just want to kind of touch this topic because I think it's important to address in terms of education with the client. Because with other exercises, it can be really obvious to describe, but with leg presses, people are clouded because of the dogma around barbell squats. So the first thing that I would say to this person of squats are better, I would say something like, oh, like what has your experience of squats been like, right? A lot of people, maybe they have a very good experience with squats, and so that's why they like it. But I find that a greater proportion of people are just kind of dogmatically attached to the squats are better thing because they've heard, 20 other people say it and they've just heard it their whole life. So the first thing to do is ask them about their experience and validate that experience. So if the person has had a great exercise or a great experience with that exercise, great, validate that experience, fantastic. Squats are awesome, right? Don't deny it, don't push it away, don't react with a kind of like egotistical, like I am the smarter person type of thing, because trust me, I've done it, I've made that mistake too many times not to know it. So validate the experience. If they've had a bad experience or no experience, then just ask them with a kind of genuine curiosity, oh, okay, so, if you've had this bad experience, or if you have no experience, why, like, where does that opinion come from, right? And just someone, first of all, hearing that you want to understand where they're coming from as a trainer, as a clinician, whatever it may be, or just as a training partner and as a friend, that's the most important thing, because human connection is number one. The facts and all the other things come after that. Many of you may have heard this expression of like, facts don't care about your feelings. Feelings don't care about your facts. Okay, so start at the level of the feeling and then get down to the facts. By the time you get to the facts, most of the time you don't need to have any kind of like debate or discussion. But the way that the direction that I turn things when I am talking about leg press and why I love leg press so much and why it's such a fantastic exercise and why it shouldn't be seen as lesser is just because you can explain it to them like, it's just basically a squat for your lower body where your spine doesn't really have to do nearly as much work, right? Just explain it that way. Because ultimately, at the level of the joints don't know the difference. The knees, the hips, the spine obviously does, but like the knees and the hips, they're just experiencing a force and a force direction from the feet that is influencing from the foot through the shin, through the knee joint, and through the hip joint. They're just experiencing torque. And this is really where things get down sort of to the most fundamental level, which is that exercise is ultimately just the human body's interaction with the external world and external forces. And if you can explain anything at that level, then all of the dogma, and you truly understand it, all of the dogma around exercise just drops, because every exercise just becomes a kind of dance between anatomy, muscles, joints, and whatever force. You don't even have to name the force, you just have to know that it's force. And all force, at least at its fundamental level, for our purposes, quantum, mechanics people may say something nuanced and different, and I don't know if any of you are of that kind of thing, so I don't want to step on your toes here, but like all forces are fundamentally the same, right? They're just pushes or pulls, however you conceptualize them. So bring it down to the level of the fundamental, address the emotional experience, validate the emotional experience of the person, whoever it may be, and you can have much better conversations, in my experience, doing that kind of thing. So that's the first kind of major question that's commonly asked that typically gets people fired up. The second is concepts related to locking out the knees. My stance on this is that locking the knees in a leg press is not inherently bad, but given certain kinds of client populations, it may be more or less risky. So for example, someone like me, I get to a point in my leg press where I'm using a heavy enough load where my legs just kind of naturally stop before they're locked. Other people, maybe they accelerate the load a lot. My wife, for instance, is a dancer, and if this is her femur and this is her knee, and this is like the direction of bending, like this is when her knee straightens, she can get her knee to like here. So you don't want someone probably, most likely, who can bend their knee to like 10 or 15 degrees of hyperextension to be locking out their knees, because now their knee is being bent in like the opposite direction. It's not that that couldn't be adapted to. I just think that in those cases, it's better safe than sorry, especially if someone is paying you for a service and there are liability concerns with the gym, whatever it happens to be, play it safe. But in general, do whatever is more natural, more comfortable for you. Again, that locked knee position is not bad by any means. People do all kinds of jumping and bounding and really, really high level athletic stuff in that sort of landing in the close to the locked knee position, and people end up totally fine. So lock the knees or don't. I would lean in the direction of your kind of intuition and your comfort. And if you're someone who's worried about it, okay, stopping just shy of lockout is completely fine. Again, that's my sort of natural intuition anyway, but just like don't have a super, super, super strong stance on it, because much like the pain thing, the stronger the stance that you have, the more you limit your options. The more you limit your options, the fewer people, including yourself, that you're going to be able to help ultimately. All right, last but not least, before I get to the free resource section of this video, programming considerations. So the first thing to recognize, two things to recognize about the leg press. Number one, it is by nature a lengthened dominant motion. What that means is basically that your quads and your hip muscles are loaded more when they're in a more stretched position. So if you think about what the spectrum of quad loading would look like, it would be like the leg pressing type motions are the motions that are going to be more stretch focused, at least for those single joint tissues, right? Forgetting about the rectus femoris for now. And so that would be like a leg press thing, like fully knee bent is the challenge position. And then fully knee straight is something like a leg extension. So when you're considering programming, if you're doing a ton of other squatting motions already and you love to do all those other squatting motions, well, leg extension would fill a sort of gap, so to speak, in your training. A leg press might not be the appropriate thing for you if you're trying to sort of check boxes that you don't already have checked. Conversely, if you're only doing leg extensions, then leg presses would fill a gap that you need filled in terms of just training the full range of contraction of the quads. If you think about this from the perspective of the glute max, if you're already doing lots of things like deadlifts and RDLs and split squats, well, leg press would be redundant with those because it's a stretch variation. Not that it would be bad, redundancy is good to some degree, but you would maybe want to consider adding something more like a hip thrust to fill that space as a contrast to the leg press. So if you're already doing a lot of leg presses, then checking the box of the short position stuff for the glute max, that would be a great idea. And so it is with the adductor magnus muscle. Like a good example of a shorter muscle length variation of that would be like some kind of adduction motion where you can really focus on when the adductors are fully squeezed, right? So understanding those kinds of things in terms of the nature of complementary exercises can help you better sort of select different options at different times. The second major thing to consider aside from the muscle length is just the rep range concept. So I already talked a little bit about this in the pain section, but leg presses are so fantastic because they're super stable. There's so many adjustments that you can make to account for your individuality. And as a consequence of that, you can use all sorts of rep ranges. You can do sets of 20, you can do sets of 5, you can do sets of 10 or 15. Pick the rep range that you feel like best suits you and your goal. And if you are uncomfortable with certain rep ranges, well then start with rep ranges that you are comfortable with, and maybe over time you explore, going into the opposite range. If you're comfortable with low reps, maybe over time you start to get better at high reps or vice versa. Or if you're just happy with what you're doing, then stick with what you're doing, and if you're seeing results from it, no one can really tell you that it's wrong for you. And then lastly, because we talk so much about the bias thing, I do just want to reiterate here that the bias thing is a bias thing. It's a percentage thing, it's a shifting thing, it's a spectrum, it's not a black or white. Also keep in mind that the bias doesn't make it right in absolute. The bias is only appropriate if it's relative to your goal. So if you're trying to target your glutes, but for some reason your legs are, your feet are super low, well, that doesn't make sense, and vice versa. If you don't want a super strong bias and you want to strike that hybrid sort of middle ground, well, then pick the thing sort of in between. There's no right or wrong in the black or white sense. It's just what version of the leg press is appropriate for you right now, given the constraints of your program and your particular goals and what you're trying to do in a session. Now, I did just want to cover one more variation of leg pressing stuff, which is just the single leg version. The main reason that I would use a single leg version, there are two main reasons. One is if you found that using two legs and the amount of load that you're either putting onto the machine is a lot of load, like just some people are so strong that they fill up all the sleeves with the leg press plates. Using a single leg is, number one, just a lower cost way to kind of set up the exercise. You're going to use a lot less load doing it that way, so it's just less total setup. Although obviously you do have to do both sides if you're going to do it that way. Number one, but number two, it's also just less total load on the spine. So if you're someone who has back-related issues and you're finding that bracing is super, super hard because of how much load you're using, then using one leg at a time can be really helpful. And then lastly, using one leg at a time can allow for a little bit more of like a kind of adducted position, right? So if you have 2 feet and you're here versus if you have 1 foot, you can kind of put your, kind of shift your leg inward. That can be a way to actually get your leg almost across your body, which, and again, I won't spend too much time on this, but bringing your leg kind of across your body and doing it a little bit more like your leg is on the midline, which obviously you can't do with 2 legs because you can't go like this with your feet, I don't think. Shifting the leg over a little bit can be a great way to get a little bit more of the upper glute max involved, just because you're starting in a little bit more of an adducted position and the path of motion that you use will be a little bit more specific to the upper glute max. So you could do something like this where you are using a single leg where you're centering that leg a little bit more. You can see I have it centered here, and that can just be a nice way to get a little bit more of a glute bias, even more than the 2 leg variation that we were talking about before, just because that plane is more specific to all things glutes rather than having wider stance stance and being more, again, adductor focused. So this is just an application for that. You could also do a quad dominant version of this. It's not like the quads will respond differently to different hip positions, but it is something to consider more so from the spinal perspective and the stability perspective. All right, so that was a bit of a long video, and if you are confused, you feel overwhelmed by it, I have a free resource, a free guide that's based on all the information in this video. So if you just kind of want the quick hitter points, the quick hitter information, and also just something that even if you've watched all this, like you want as a refresher, some reminders that you can take literally with you, in your pocket to the gym, click the link in the description and in the pinned comment, join my free community, go to the free resources section, go to the YouTube resources, go to the leg press guide, and you can download it at absolutely no cost. Again, it's a free community, so you just join for free, and then you find that leg press guide right in there. And in addition, when you're in the community, I also have a paid membership, which includes a ton of different things, including live calls with me if you want more in-depth help. It includes access to all my courses now, and it also includes access to full-length member-only content and video form reviews. So if you're interested in membership, please consider it. It really helps me and it supports my work directly, and I'm able to help all of you more individually, and allows me to keep making these kinds of videos. So overall, I hope you enjoyed this. Please share it with a friend if you found it useful, if you found that it helps you in some way. Sharing it with a friend is the best thing that you can do for me to support me in my channel, of course, other than signing up for my paid membership. But all of that regardless is helpful, and I really genuinely appreciate your time and your attention to all things leg pressing. So I'll see you all in the free community or the paid community, hopefully, and if I don't, I'll see you all in the next video.